almost lunch. We've got 2 more. I'm Natasha Sandmeier. I'll be presenting Diploma 9. I've been teaching the unit, I think this is possibly the 8th year, and then before I was teaching in the intermediate school, and I also direct the summer school. So before we begin, before I begin on the year-long brief, I wanted to first, in a way, talk about the unit agenda, because I feel like in order to really understand where we are with the brief, you need to understand the unit at large. And the unit is ultimately, and has always been, about context. But our context isn't one that's described through geographical affiliations or location or GPS. It's not place. It is, the unit is, and our idea of context has always been, in our world at least, about the relationships, the connections, the interwoven linkages between artifacts, people, events, cultures, histories, and places that describe and form a world. So the unit itself operates, hold on, I forgot the slides. The unit itself operates as an interconnected set of self-contained worlds that sit within a collective and interrelated terrain of ideas, of projects, and protagonists. The projects, and thereby the unit, and this is a drawing of the book cover of the work of the unit from the past few years, and that's a drawing that one of the students, Jeffrey, produced, which collects together all of the projects together on one world. So in a way, this one describes probably best Diploma 9. And the projects and the unit feature an almost constant rearrangement of fictional or factual past, present, and future architectures, all towards the goal of describing an architecture and the context within which that architecture sits. So whether working on infinitesimally small rooms or spaces, or whether taking on the characteristics of a much larger city, the unit's always considered the elements, events, characters, players, histories as the most important considerations of what describes a place, an architecture, and a context. And that's what we call context. So there's a kind of big picture of where we sit with the unit. But importantly, over the course of the last few years, in particular last year where we've begun this new brief, and what I'll be talking about today in more detail, is how the projects have come to interrogate more than what would normally call architecture. We've come to pursue also the idea of the author and the architect. So we're now in the 2nd year of our agenda that interrogates the architect as project, or an architecture as that new form of context. We are ultimately the makers of our own context, so why aren't we included in that very conversation? So the unit aims to do just that, to open up the practice, to include the person who does that practice of architecture. So last year, we explored the medium of production, and we were examining the space of the unbuilt projects and worlds that existed really only on paper. And they existed only on that paper that they were drawn on, and we were experiencing the collective minds and memories of the imagination in their audience. But this year, we're going to explore the space of production, so we're really moving into the factory. We shifted from how we worked to where we worked. We've shifted to the factory floor and to the artist studio. So the factory will be the place in which you invent, combine, manufacture your findings. It's where you transgress what we call the authentic with the subjective. And the purpose of that space isn't to collect and preserve knowledge, it is to create it. So it's the space where you decide what goes into your world, what becomes a part of it, and what doesn't. So if the architect is the project, then the question is, what are we making, and where are we making it? But in the unit, we're also going to be working with 2 factory types. I've just kind of mentioned them. It's essential to acknowledge both as important and defining factors in different forms of revolution. One, a cultural revolution, and the other, an industrial revolution. So on the left, I will stop with the PowerPoint-looking slides shortly. But on the left are factories of the kind that kind of come to mind when you say the word factory. They make products, they make things. So it's a sampling of institutions that were instrumental in the changing of where and how we make things, and they've been responsible for transforming vast landscapes and cityscapes. And on the other side, you have art studios, culture centers, and other kind of formative projects that were crucial to the manufacturing of forms of identity. But Europe notably invented the factory in the middle of the 19th century, so it now has to reinvent the factory in the early 21st century. as it's being left behind by other far more industrialized nations. So we first talk about product factories. So a good place to begin is in the Arsenale in Venice, because that's where large-scale assembly first took hold, originally began in the early 1300s, centuries before the Industrial Revolution, where ships could amazingly be assembled in as little as one per day by a vast army of people. But surprisingly, the efficiency of this enterprise and the ingenuity of it and its scale didn't spread out to anywhere else across Europe until many, many centuries later. So it remained an isolated center of industrial and assembly ingenuity. So prior to this, most industry was in the form of the cottage industry or home industry, where workers were given tasks to complete at home. But until the Cromford mill from the 1770s, very little changed across that European landscape. But by the late 1700s, England and Europe had a huge demand for cotton. They discovered cotton. It was a nice change from the itchy wool. And this led to a kind of domino effect of increased manufacturing that precipitated the Industrial Revolution. So it was the first mill to introduce water and steam as the key power source. So while the inventions for the machining and the spinning of cotton were important, what was more important was the source of power for these mills. So the demand for resources, both for cotton and for water, led to faster production, in turn requiring ever more and greater resources. So this led to a natural and extraordinary cycle of inventions that transformed the sourcing of the manufacturing process. So in the space of about 30 to 50 years, the English textile industry was completely revamped, the cottage and domestic industry was wiped out, and formerly skilled, highly skilled artisans soon had to stand next to unskilled laborers and even children in these mills. So that kind of effect rippled across England and then later Europe, transforming landscapes and population densities across the continent as the factories were built near rivers, so towns grew around them, and the first great rural to urban migration took place. Going back a tiny bit in time, in France in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, Ledoux designed this Royal Salt Works at a time when salt was exceedingly valuable, and it was an essential commodity. But his innovation isn't the form, the symmetrical layout, or the kind of process by which the salt was extracted. Rather, it was that he located the factory near the woods, near the forests, whose trees he used for fuel. So it's again a kind of innovation that's about the fuel and not about the actual space of production. So the salt was extracted from vaporizing the water from saline wells, and he used the wood to fuel the fires. So it's a counterintuitive decision for where and how to locate a factory, but it reduced massively the relatively difficult transportation of wood. So Ford pioneered a massive assembly plant in Detroit at a time and at a scale that had never before seen, here with a factory designed by Albert Kahn. And it incorporated the architect at a transformative moment in time. So the plant marked Detroit as the home of the new car industry. And like Ledoux Salt Works, it was located in Detroit for a few, in some cases, arbitrary reasons. The first and most important one was that Henry Ford lived in Detroit. And that's in a way not to be underestimated. It was also the center of the country where easy access to steel, iron, and other raw materials were accessible by rail and waterways. And it was already a home to many other small-scale heavy industry, and very near the slaughterhouses of Chicago, which had famously set up the first, not assembly line, but disassembly lines, taking apart the meat. So again, location, I think, is strategic, but for counterintuitive reasons. Around the same time, a young architect called Matte Trucco designed his Fiat factory in Lingotto. And while it's less efficient than the American models, the factory was configured interestingly over 5 floors, so you can see in the bottom, where the raw materials went in on the ground floor, and then the finished car exited at the top at the test track. How cool. So the architecture is obviously hugely innovating, but ultimately, as with many other European models, it exhausted itself in the 70s and then was closed. But there's a moment here in these past few projects where the architect has the opportunity to engage in a manufacturing process. So So I'll end the short sequence with Prouvé. And again, it's not a kind of exhaustive history of the factory. I just want to really point out some key kind of ideas of projects that were crucial in transforming the industrialized processes of Europe. So Prouvé, because he crossed the divide, I think, productively between the two forms of factories, the identity and the product factories, is an important one to look at. His studio was as much a kind of harbinger of technology as it was of design and lifestyle. The ateliers were workshops, they were testing spaces, they were laboratories where ideas were crafted into products, into furniture, into buildings at varying scales. He worked with the most advanced technologies of the time, available to transform an idea into a finished piece. And he involved, most importantly, the knowledge of material, technological advancements, and collaboration with artists and craftsmen. And particularly in his work, you can see the hand of the individual. And for me, that's one of the key kind of points where we're at. In an age of mass production, where the production of one thing depends on the bringing together of a vast array of mass-produced materials sourced from wildly diverse locations and places, we know that a system with that kind of growth is fragile. If one thing fails, the whole system either has to transform or it collapses. So with a global infrastructure supplying a global population with mass-produced items assembled by a workforce that operates collectively, what has happened to the individual, and how do we even insert the individual into that very context? After graduation, a few of you might start your own practices, but most of you will most likely begin life after the AA working in an office, an established office of some kind. And in an environment where you all work towards a collective goal and a collective identity, how do you now begin to shape your own architectural identity? Particularly as a diploma student about to embark on that career, I think it's a very important question. So I ask that you consider your place within this broad, huge, and interconnected environment, that you locate the individual within that kind of context. Anand's project last year addressed all the individual moments and places along the manufacturing of an architecture where we sit at the table, from room to table to landscape, in order to meaningfully kind of examine how to transform from concept, how to transform a thing from concept to manufactured reality. And that project came out of a realization that any construction or assembly process is now part of a complex, globalized process with logistical operations that boggle the mind. He had two really interesting examples that he worked with, the Airbus A380 and Nutella. And those two examples, while wildly disparate, brought to light how unfathomable many of those systems are. So the A380's assembly begins with structural sections of the plane in France, Germany, Spain, and UK. They're brought, those that aren't in France, are brought by special surface transportation systems and barges. The front and rear fuselage are boarded in Hamburg, shipped to the UK. Wings are made at Filden in the UK and Broughton and sent to Moston, where the ship then gets added to it. Then that goes to Saint-Nazaire, where the ship swaps fuselage for larger assembled sections, and then it goes on to Bordeaux. Then it goes to Cadiz in Spain to collect the belly and tail, and it delivers them back to Pauillac in France. The process continues until all of those are finally assembled in Toulouse. So what we know from that is that the factory is no longer a single place. Nutella, the breakfast of champions. What could be simpler than chocolate in a jar? So it was originally, decades ago, produced in Italy, is now made from ingredients from all over the world. Hazelnuts from Turkey, palm oil from Malaysia, cocoa from Nigeria, sugar from Brazil, vanilla from China. And the global supply chains are complex for food, for products, for planes, and ultimately also for architecture, but it's not really anything that we acknowledge or understand at that scale. And the ability of the architect to think around the isolated parts in that chain of production is an invaluable way to think about the comprehensive and expansive world that architecture has become. At a very tiny scale, in the past few years, we've had a few students who've entered into that manufacturing process, to show one here. In this case, Adam Furman, who was working with marble. And it's just a tiny piece of one of his vaults in what ended up being a massive, massive project. And he didn't design a factory, but he did work closely with a manufacturing process, which to his surprise, once he transmitted files to Italy, it demanded a close understanding of not only the machining processes, but also the forms of labor that were involved. Manufacturing the piece in Italy required him to redesign pieces to adjust for what the machine could do and then for how much time he would allow the final hand processing. The next series of drawings by Oliver from last year were studies into form and identity. And the first was his capture of the AA as a kind of architecture culture factory. Deliberately void of students in this drawing and void of a core. It's in a way just a shell, right? Without us, it is but the shed. And I think we can all agree that numbers 39 to 32 Bedford Square are not the AA. It's really all of you, all of us, and all of the visitors in the audience together that make the AA and that create that kind of culture. In this drawing, ironically, I think drawn by hand, it interrogates the idea of authorship and production of work so often and too easily, let's say, printed by machine. And this last one, where those cities and factories and worlds come together, where different worlds and assemblies and forms are spliced together to create a whole new identity out of disparate pieces. So now if we look at the other kind of factory, the identity factory, important to the unit and in terms of cultural precedence will certainly be in the foreground of our intellectual positioning. These factories that I'll show produce identity, they produce culture. So here are two of them, the Ford Bomber factory and Andy Warhol's The Factory. And here so Warhol's left, it was the epicenter of the New York art scene throughout the 60s. And the factory, like the product factories that we saw before, collected and imported individuals and artifacts like the many raw materials on a production line. And so that space worked on quite a lot of levels. On the one hand, it was a cultural locus, and much of its production was even internalized and cannibalized for its own use. And then on the flip side, it was also quite literally a production factory, and many of the factory residents produced Warhol's art. So importantly, the impact of what went on within the room was enormous outside of the room. So the factory itself is as culturally significant as the pieces, the artworks, and the films it produced. The space was both a space of production as well as its own product. Another, if less well-known, cultural epicenter, a more restrained one, is Donald Judd's home on 101 Spring Street. So he was a real believer in the permanent installation, believing that the surroundings of an artwork shape how it's viewed. He was frustrated by the practice of always having to install his works into galleries and museums, only months later to then have to uninstall them. And so the idea of art's relation to place, alongside his incredibly minimal kind of design interiors, led this house, 101 Spring Street, to become a home and a kind of ground zero for both of those kinds of conversations with other artists and his students. And in the house, it is its own museum. In the house are works from Jean Arp, Klaus Oldenburg, Kurt Schwitters, Frank Stella, Alvar Aalto, Carl Andre, Dan Flavin, Marcel Duchamp, and lots of others. I think he has about 500 pieces that are all kind of distributed throughout the house. And it became both a record of culture as well as a proponent of ideals. This example is probably the most factory-like of the culture factories. Lino Bobardi's SEC Pompeia transformed a massive urban behemoth into a factory, into a center that promoted non-discriminatory public space, living space, exhibition space, social space, and simply the goal was to foster a kind of cultural diversity. She said, the artist's freedom has always been individual, but true freedom can only be collective. A freedom aware of social responsibilities which can knock down the frontier of aesthetics. And the defining aspect of this space is the very essence of the culture it defines, not necessarily how it looks. So another identity factory is Duchamp's boîte aux valises. He went so far as to create entire museum installations that could be unpacked from a single leather-bound suitcase. He collapsed the divide between artificially invented reality of an artifact and the realm of its installation. So he was able to confound the relationship between content and context like few other art projects and artists of his time. The simple act of unpacking that suitcase installs identity into the space. And that's a really important kind of moment. Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas aggregates images, but in an altogether different way to Duchamp. What Warburg attempts to create is an almost bibliographic set of relationships that describe and that extract the sort of emotive qualities and intellectual pursuits of movements, cultures, aesthetics, memory, mythology, and emotions. He attempted to trace and describe cultural affinities through the artifact of the image. And what he hoped to create was an understanding, an experience of the history of art and all of its inherent narratives. So he manufactured an experience of history, culture, and thought. So here we shift to identity factories that strip identity in the process of questioning or defining it. The Bechers photographed hundreds, if not thousands, of abandoned industrial buildings over time, collecting collections of similarities in order to exactly isolate the differences in form and composition. I think what's really interesting about how they worked was photographs were always taken on overcast days to eliminate even the possible narrative that a shadow might add to a particular form. To move from one collection of images to another, Cindy Sherman challenges the issue of identity, of stereotypes, of cliché. She completely suppresses her own identity with that of her subjects, and her untitled film stills, along with her later work, is an incredible exercise in identity transformation, incorporating, like Donald Judd, the setting and the narrative as a vital part of the work. So, the last of the identity factories, Facebook. Almost certainly one of the most pervasive, if not insidious, identity machines on the planet. It's a forum where identity is created and maintained at a relatively high fictional, I think, aesthetic level with very little true identity captured at all. And what's strange is what you like in turn determines what you see, and what you like determines how others see you. By like, I mean, like. And that's really an issue that we all need to be able to understand and control as individuals. The identity today is more in flux than ever before. We need to capture how to claim that as architects. So that's why we're working on The Architect. And the 3-year agenda we're now in the middle of, The Architect as Project, is where we are with that pursuit. We're in a world defined by and enclosed by figures, by the buildings, the plans, and the drawings that describe our world, but the one figure we often neglect is that of the architect. But as we know, the figure wasn't always ignored. Da Vinci drew the figure according to Vitruvius's descriptions and dimensions. He inscribed him within the circle and square, proving the architect has always been in the drawing. Charles Jeanneret realized relatively early on in his career the need to define his own image as an artist and an architect before defining his work. He believed that anyone could reinvent his identity, and so he adopted the pseudonym Le Corbusier at a key moment when he also defined his ideological and theoretical pursuits. As a figure, he became inseparable from his code of belief and his formal architectural profession. So the figure is really present throughout, but we need to emphasize more what Liszewski's aim was, that the artist, the architect can and should be an agent for change, not just for groove. So with that in mind, I think the Eames are always an important reference, as their total body of work was of an extremely broad scope. They reached out to all kinds of disciplines and processes involved in textile design, in graphics, in furniture, the leg splints for the military, and they explored notions of scale through film, alongside all aspects of their work, ranging from toys to architecture. So they were really the architects of their own lives, not just architecture. And they manufacture that identity at every scale. It's a great example of where an architectural project takes on a life and trajectory of its own, encompassing all aspects of scales and design. But too often the cultural legacy of these kinds of projects stays at the symbolic level and somehow misses the point entirely. Like the Beaux-Arts Ball in the 30s, where we see architects wearing their buildings. And later we see P.J. Philip Johnson as a building in this amazing billboard of him in front of one of his buildings under construction. So we see the idea of the architect without really interrogating the culture of making architecture, of its very authorship. So as a direct result of that, we have become the project. And as much as we'll be working on various forms of the factory, it'll be impossible to define a position or a manifesto without first establishing yourself through it. Your position and your factory will be an extension of you. So on that note, I'll just show some student work. We haven't really worked on the factory before, but the following projects all explore questions of identity making in today's pursuit of architecture. In a recent Dip 9 project, Antoine shifted from his studio to the film studio, another kind of identity factory, to collage together the archaeology of an architect and his oeuvre. So he collected all the players in Mises' life and all the people who've written extensively on his work, on his project, and around the extensive narrative of Mises' world in all the ways that it could have possibly connected through varying degrees of separation back to Antoine himself. But Antoine finally, perhaps belatedly, realized that he was building his own identity through the scrutiny of others. And so he concludes, Mies, I came here to ask where you sit as an architect. What is your position? And in the end, it appears that the question was really where I should sit. And so by interrogating another, he discovers himself. Eleanor Dodman's project addressed the housing estate and the identity crisis in particular of London's East End estates. And this project came about after a long walk through Hackney, during which she documented dozens of estates, noting that they were all fundamentally generic, no surprise. And they offered little opportunity to the inhabitant to locate oneself within as individual. So where the housing estates once represented the most modern accommodation in England with in-house bathrooms, electricity, and running water, not at all common anywhere else in England in the 50s and 60s, over time they've taken on a much less savory and less humane identity. So much like Thomas de Man's paper creations, what Eleanor did was really transform those images to drawing, to model, to film, and back again to force the reader constantly to disassociate the subject from the emotional narratives. And this is a huge, I don't know, at least 2 meters, model through which she rebuilt some of those housing interiors. And the model was never seen in this view. It was only ever seen through these views, from the perspective of the camera, to constantly challenge the perspective the viewer might have to the subject matter. So her drawings also took on a third-person quality, wherein she drew the room within which her project was made. And we see that same council estate coming out of the plotter on the right. And then, flanking both sides of the studio, and it's also the building within which she herself is in. And then we see finally exposed on her studio table, we see the materials with which she fabricated that new visual narrative of the council estate. And the model on the table, the backdrops on the side, and the original drawing outside the window in the distance. It's like an mise en abîme without the mirror. So Ariadne Bard smashed the paper projects of Lissitzky's Towers and Mises' Friedrichstrasse. She argued that their weight in memory identity was far greater than any material calculation that their build state would have totaled. And with her project, she proposed a monolith so large it required a collective effort, a hand of cities to build. And that architecture was without program, without function, without formal articulation. Rather, this architecture could only be defined by the communal effort required to raise it. So her provocation was the idea of participatory architecture, where the level of participation didn't amount to just entering the building or looking at the building. You had to make it. It was instead a kind of visceral and tangible experience of digging the earth, pulling the tower, and reconfiguring the city, importantly, together. So it's a process that she repeated at a small scale at every jury, and she asked her critics to participate in the raising of the tower. And what it did was transform the audience into a participant and into a co-author. So we identified with the process and with the product. Elena's project, called the Narcissist City, began that year with Peele's early 19th century painting, The Portrait of the Artist, in his museum. So the artist, in the painting, holds open the curtain to show his museum in the background. And that room in the painting is the room in which the painting hung at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And that collapsing of identity with artifact into its imagined and actual site really collapses geography with identity. So those two contexts and ideas become interchangeable. So Elena looked at the immediate foreground of the painting as the front edge of Peele's creative space, his studio. And that studio became the space for the production of work and of its maker's identity. And it allowed the subject to shift from the self-portrait of the inhabitant to the city and then back again. So with her thesis, she created a self-portrait of the city, here unfolded, but in reality a box into which one could see. But it's a room that only exists with an inhabitant. And that personal experience then extended beyond the room and into the metropolis to form a view of the world that's entirely personal. I think this is the last project. So when George first installed this in our unit space upstairs, it led to a kind of unavoidable speculation regarding the disconnectedness of our space in the AA, for the most part constrained by the fact that we're living in houses, that we're working in domestic architecture. But it also challenged the very forms by which we represent and explore architecture as a concept from within the architecture of the studio. So this project never knowingly left the walls of the AA. And while building a critique of the modernist forms of connectivity that spans several cities, from London to Paris to New York, and several decades, including a conversation with Corbusier regarding the merits of the domino versus George's ontological holes, ultimately and inevitably, the project ends where it begins. And that's in the architect's studio, more specifically in our studio, where we create our fictions and where we envision and manufacture worlds unconstrained by walls and barriers. So the unit space, our studio, our factory, is where I'll end. Quick word about just two things. Unit trip, we're going to Switzerland, northern Switzerland, for factories, and we'll go from there up to Berlin to visit the artist studios of Demand, Eliasson, and every other studio we can get into. And then we will also have MANOLIS Stavrakakis, who'll be joining us this year to lead a series of seminars with the unit on the ideas of identity, production, and the factory, and he'll be joining us for tutorials and seminars throughout the year. Thank you very much.